Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Aatif Rashid's Book Club. I'm Aatif Rashid, and on today's episode, we're going to be discussing Orhan Pamuk's My Name is Red, a novel first published in 1998 and translated into English in 2001 by Erdağ Göknar. I want to make sure to credit the translator here, and I want to do this whenever we do a translated novel such as this one, because obviously we're going to be discussing the novel in English. The passages that I'm going to be reading are in English, and so a lot of credit needs to go to the translator for bringing us this language, for bringing us these words. Now, My Name is Red is probably Orhan Pamuk's most famous novel. Orhan Pamuk is a Turkish writer. He's probably the most famous living Turkish writer, you could argue. He won the Nobel Prize in 2006. And this, as I said, this is perhaps his most famous novel for a few reasons, I think. On the one hand, it's a very fun novel. It's a murder mystery set in the Ottoman Empire in 1591, right? 16th century murder mystery. In that sense, it has a lot of similarities to The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, which is another historical murder mystery and another novel that we're going to be talking about on this podcast sometime in the future. I think the other reason, though, that this novel is his most famous and most well-known is, I think through this novel, he really gets at some profound themes about art and about the differences between what we call Western art, right, European art. In this particular novel, it's often referred to as Venetian art, the Venetian style, in contrast to miniatures, Ottoman art, the art associated with Asia, with the Middle East, with the Islamic world. And Orhan Pamuk really insightfully explores some of the fundamental differences between these two artistic styles. And in doing so, I think also makes a kind of commentary on individualism, which we're going to touch on as we discuss this novel today in this podcast. So let's get into some of the larger features of this novel. So I think the most obvious aspect of the novel to anyone, when you first look at it, is of course the multiple points of view. This novel is structured around multiple points of view, and the very first chapter begins with the title, I Am a Corpse. So immediately we get a chapter from the point of view of the corpse, of the person who has just been murdered. Beyond just the corpse, we also have chapters from the perspective of lots of different characters who feature in the novel. We have a chapter from the perspective of a dog. We have several chapters from the perspectives of painted creatures and painted objects, right, such as a tree, a gold coin. We have a chapter from the perspective of death. We have a chapter from the perspective of Satan. We have a chapter from the perspective of the color red, which is, of course, where we get the title of the novel, My Name is Red. So on the one hand, the reason I think Orhan Pamuk writes this novel, tells us this story through multiple points of view. On the one hand, it's a fun, postmodern trick. This novel fits right in with, I think, a range of novels that can be generally described as postmodern. I sort of think of this novel, right? So it came out in the 1990s. So I think of this novel as similar stylistically, thematically, etc., to novels by Salman Rushdie, like Midnight's Children, as well as some of his other historical novels by Zadie Smith, right? And part of you could even argue novels by Thomas Pynchon to some extent, although maybe that connection is a little more distant. But the idea here is a lot of these novels that we call postmodern have a multiplicity of voices, a multiplicity of perspectives. And the idea behind a lot of these late 20th century postmodern works, and I think maybe Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace is the most famous of these, I think the uniting theme about a lot of these works is that they're interested in this idea of multiplicity. They're interested in this idea that you cannot get to truth from a single point of view or a single perspective, that you have to approach what we call truth from a panoply of perspectives. But I think beyond just that, more specifically for Orhan Pamuk, beyond just the general idea of him as a postmodern writer and this as a postmodern novel, the very idea of the miniature as a style of painting lends itself to this type of storytelling. So to put it like this, right, as we know, the central tension of this novel, something we're going to talk about a lot, is the tension between two styles of art, between European portraiture, right, Renaissance portraiture, which is just emerging here in Venice, right, what he calls the Venetian style, what a lot of the characters refer to as the Venetian style or the Frankish style, in contrast to the miniature, right, the Ottoman style. And in a miniature, for those of you who are unfamiliar with what a miniature looks like, you've probably seen some of these kinds of paintings before. The perspective tends to be very distant, almost two-dimensional. There is not an individual single perspective. There is not necessarily an individual point of view that the image is drawn from. Instead, you could argue the point of view is the point of view of God, is the point of view of a distant entity looking down upon buildings, human beings, armies, gardens, etc. And it lends these miniatures a certain artificial quality, right? They look, to some extent, unrealistic, but it also lends them, I think, a certain transcendent quality. The emphasis of the miniature is that here is a perspective beyond the human. Here is the perspective of God, multiple different characters, multiple different consciousnesses. And you could argue that that's this novel, right? That this novel is told through this multiplicity of point of views in order to reflect the style of miniature painting. And we're going to get more into this as we talk about some of the key themes of the novel, some of the tensions surrounding miniatures versus individual portraits. Now, there is a main character in this novel. There is a protagonist, a traditional kind of protagonist, a character named Black. You know, his storyline follows the kind of traditional protagonist's storyline. He's the one who works in the book trade. He's going to investigate the murders. He has some personal investment in investigating the murders. There's also a love story, right? He's interested in marrying someone. So Black's journey over the course of the novel follows the traditional protagonist. But I would argue he's not the most interesting part of the novel. His chapters are entertaining and interesting, and obviously he's the closest thing to an audience stand-in, right? Someone who is outside this world ever so slightly, looking in on this world and investigating this world when the murder mystery starts to happen. So Black is our audience stand-in. He's the one that maybe we connect with the most. But of course, he's not the most interesting character in the novel itself. In terms of passages, I want to start not at the beginning of the novel necessarily. So this is obviously a very long novel, right? The version I have is 500 pages. So we could spend a long time quoting key passages from this novel. Instead, the passages that I've chosen for our discussion today focus on what I think are kind of the big themes of the novel that have to do with this idea of style and that have to do with the tension between these different styles of art. So let's look first at the chapter titled, I Am a Murderer. So this is chapter 4. Right, chapter 4. It's really called I Will Be Called a Murderer. And in this chapter, right, we get the murderer's voice. Now, one of the entertaining aspects of this book is that Orhan Pamuk really wants us to, very playfully kind of prods us to try and guess who we think the murderer is. The murderer will constantly have these chapters where he will talk about his motivations, what he did. He will also be playing with us and asking us, can you guess who I am? And there is, I think, a way to guess who the murderer is, though it's very subtle. But for now, I want us to look at chapter 4, and I want us to look a few pages in where we talk about this idea of style. So he says, you realize, in fact, that I'm explaining all these things because they relate to my predicament. But if I were to divulge even one detail related to the killing itself, you'd figure it all out, and this would relieve me from being a nameless, faceless murderer roaming among you like an apparition, and relegate me to the status of an ordinary, confessed criminal who has given himself up, soon to pay for his crime with his head. Give me the license not to dwell on every single detail. Allow me to keep some clues to myself. Try to discover who I am from my choice of words and colors, as attentive people like yourselves might examine footprints to catch a thief. This in turn brings us to the issue of style, which is now of widespread interest. Ought a miniaturist, have his own personal style? A use of color? A voice all his own? So a few things going on with that passage. On the one hand, there's the kind of classic postmodern kind of meta commentary, right? He's asking us to kind of do literary analysis, basically, as we read this novel. He's saying you can use your literary skills, your reading skills, your attention to detail and color to try and figure out who I am. At the same time, he ends this passage with this key question. Does a miniaturist have a personal style? Or even should a miniaturist have a personal style? Now, we know that the murderer is one of the miniaturists in the workshop of the Sultan. The person who was killed at the beginning of the novel was one of the miniaturists. And so we know that this murder has something to do with tension between the different miniaturists. And eventually, we're going to sort of meet three of the miniaturists who are essentially our three suspects: Butterfly, Stork, and Olive. And each of them are miniaturists working in the Sultan's workshop, and each of them to some extent have their own voice and style. And that's our clue to figuring out who the murderer is. But the tension here that he sets up, should a miniaturist have a sense of personal style, is one of the fundamental tensions of the novel. Because for a lot of the great miniaturists, their individual style or their individual kind of recognition as an artist is meant to be less important than the larger glory of their job, right? The idea, the kind of aesthetic theory behind a lot of these miniaturists is that they're serving God through their paintings, right? And as a result, they shouldn't be expecting personal accolades or personal recognition even. This is going to be very diametrically opposed to the European school of painting, in which personal recognition, right, the individual recognition of an artist is of paramount importance. And so the question he poses here, should a miniaturist even have a style, gets at the tension that's at the heart of the novel, around individualism, around this question of individual identity and style. Continuing on, let's consider a piece by Bizad, the master of masters, patron saint of all miniaturists. I happened across this masterpiece, which also nicely pertains to my situation, because it's a depiction of murder, among the pages of a flawless 90-year-old book of the Herat school. They are, by the way, in this novel going to constantly reference the miniaturist Bizad and the Herat school as kind of the golden age of miniature painting from the past, from what we would call, from a European perspective, the Middle Ages in the Islamic world, in Central Asia. Herat, right, today is a city in Afghanistan. It emerged from the library of a Persian prince, killed in a merciless battle of succession, and recounts the story of Khusrev and Shirin. You, of course, know the fate of Khusrev and Shirin. I refer to Nizami's version, not Ferdowsi's. So Khusro and Shirin, sometimes called Khosrow and Shirin, is a famous Persian love story that's been retold by many different poets. Those two poets that they mentioned, Nizami and Ferdowsi, are two very famous Persian poets. So there are a lot of references in My Name is Red to literature of the Islamic world, of the Persian world, and of the Middle East more generally. Continuing on, the two lovers finally marry after a host of trials and tribulations. However, the young and diabolical Shiruye, Hirsev's son by his previous wife, won't give them any peace. The prince has his eye not only on his father's throne, but also his father's young wife, Shirin. Shiruye, of whom Nizami writes, his breath had the stench of a lion's mouth, by hook or crook imprisons his father and succeeds to the throne. One night, entering the bedchamber of his father and Shirin, he feels his way in the dark, and on finding the pair in bed, stabs his father in the chest with his dagger. Thus the father's blood flows till dawn, and he slowly dies in the bed that he shares with the beautiful Shirin, who remains sleeping peacefully beside him. This picture by the great master Bizad as much as the tale itself, addresses a grave fear I've carried within me for years. The horror of waking in the black of night to realize there's a stranger making faint sounds as he creeps about the blackness of the room. Imagine that the intruder wields a dagger in one hand as he strangles you with the other. Every detail, the finely wrought wall, window, and frame ornamentation, the curves and circular designs in the red rug, the color of the silent scream emanating from your clamped throat, and the yellow and purple flowers embroidered with incredible finesse and vigor on the magnificent quilt upon which the bare and vile foot of your murderer mercilessly steps as he ends your life. All of these details serve the same purpose. While augmenting the beauty of the painting, they remind you just how exquisite are the room in which you will soon die and the world you will soon leave. The indifference of the painting's beauty and of the world to your death, the fact of your being totally alone in death despite the presence of your wife, this is the inescapable meaning that strikes you. So what we have here is just an analysis by our murderer of the painting by Behzad. And the key idea that he emphasizes is that all of the details that you notice in the painting are there to remind you of the beauty of the world, right, that you're about to leave. I like this phrase that he uses, the indifference of the painting's beauty. Now, let's keep reading, though, because I want to sort of connect this to a larger idea here. This is by Behzad, the aging master said 20 years ago, as we examined the book I held in my trembling hands. His face was illuminated not by the nearby candle, but by the pleasure of observation itself. This is so Behzad that there's no need for a signature. Behzad was so well aware of this fact that he didn't hide his signature anywhere in the painting. And according to the elderly master, there was a sense of embarrassment and a feeling of shame in this decision of his. Where there is true art and genuine virtuosity, the artist can paint an incomparable masterpiece without leaving even a trace of his identity. So this is the fascinating conclusion of his analysis of this painting by Behzad. In a way, even though it's an exquisite painting, and he marvels, as we saw, at the beauty of the painting, he emphasizes that actually Behzad almost felt ashamed of the painting because his style was so obvious that he didn't even need a signature. And, you know, the murderer's master, right, as he's showing him this painting, sees this as a positive thing. Look how beautiful, look how striking Behzad's style is, that we can recognize it even without a signature. But Behzad felt embarrassed that his personal style was so obvious. And the last line there really summarizes, I think, the view of style from the point of view of the miniaturists, from the point of view of from the ideal of Islamic art. Where there is true art and genuine virtuosity, the artist can paint an incomparable masterpiece without leaving even a trace of his identity. So the idea is, if you are a true miniaturist, your identity disappears. No one can tell that this painting was by you because your identity does not matter, right? The miniature is a glorification of the world that God has created, and so you don't need your identity to be stamped on it. If anything, by having your identity on the painting, you're somehow lessening it, damaging it somehow. At the same time, it's pretty clear that our murderer loves this painting, right? Look back at that long description of the painting. The murderer really feels connected to the painting. And the emphasis there is that, the murderer puts himself in the perspective, right, of the person getting killed, of Husrev, right? All of the details he notices, the emphasis there is that the painting makes you feel like you are Husrev, you are being murdered. Now, this is an interesting thing because, as we're going to see with miniature paintings, you're not necessarily supposed to identify with a character. You're not necessarily supposed to connect to an individual character or an individual perspective. The point of view is meant to be so distant and indifferent. And yet, our murderer does connect to an individual. This is the fundamental tension in the character of the murderer that we're going to talk about. Because as we will learn by the end of the novel, the reason the murderer commits his crime is partly because he fears the disappearance of the classical tradition of miniature painting in the Ottoman Empire. He fears that it's disappearing in the face of the Venetian style. And that's why he kills, right, his fellow miniaturist. That's why he does all the things that he does. At the same time, the murderer is still clearly obsessed with the idea of individual style, with the idea of individual identification. Look at the very next paragraph. Fearing for my life, I murdered my unfortunate victim in an ordinary and crude manner. As I returned to this fire-ravaged area night after night to ascertain whether I'd left behind any traces that might betray me, questions of style increasingly arose in my head. What was venerated as style was nothing more than an imperfection or flaw that revealed the guilty hand. So this is the wonderful connection Pamuk makes here between style, the style of a painter, and the style of a murderer. In the same way that Bizad was embarrassed that his style was so obvious in the miniature, our murderer here does not want his individual style to be obvious in the murder. And yet, of course, his individual style is there. And, we, the audience, and Black, our protagonist, solve this murder precisely because the murderer cannot help but be an individual. The murderer cannot help but put his own individual style into his quote-unquote painting, right, into this murder. All right, so the other character I want to look at, the other, I think, big key character is Black's uncle, Enişte Efendi. Efendi is just an honorific, right, in the Ottoman Empire, in Turkish. He has some great lines of dialogue where, again, he describes the tension we've been talking about, the tension between European art and Ottoman art. So let's look at the next chapter, chapter 5. And if we look sort of a little bit into chapter 5, we'll see the uncle's thoughts on European art. So this is a paragraph where he's describing a journey he took to Venice. So 2 years ago, I traveled once again to Venice as the Sultan's ambassador. I observed at length the portraits that the Venetian masters had made. I did so without knowing to which scene and story the pictures belonged, and I struggled to extract the story from the image. One day I came across a painting hanging on a palazzo wall and was dumbfounded. More than anything, the image was of an individual, somebody like myself. It was an infidel, of course, not one of us. As I stared at him, though, I felt as if I resembled him. Yet he didn't resemble me at all. He had a full round face that seemed to lack cheekbones, and moreover he had no trace of my marvelous chin. Though he didn't look anything like me, as I gazed upon the picture, for some reason, my heart fluttered as if it were my own portrait. I learned from the Venetian gentleman who was giving me a tour through his palazzo that the portrait was of a friend, a nobleman like himself. He had included whatever was significant in his life in his portrait. In the background landscape, visible from the open window, there was a farm, a village, and a blending of color which made a realistic-looking forest. Resting on the table before the nobleman were a clock, books, time, evil, life, a calligraphy pen, a map, a compass, boxes containing gold coins, bric-a-brac, odds and ends, inscrutable yet distinguishable things that were probably included in many pictures, shadows of jinns and the devil, and also the picture of the man's stunningly beautiful daughter as she stood beside her father. What was the narrative that this representation was meant to embellish and complete? As I regarded the work, I slowly sensed that the underlying tale was the picture itself. The painting wasn't the extension of a story at all. It was something in its own right. And so, what is he concluding here? What is he realizing as he's looking at this painting? There's so much great stuff to analyze in this section. First of all, he's primarily confused that the painting is not part of a larger story. One of the things that we see a lot with miniatures is that they're meant to be images from traditional stories, such as the story of Khosrow and Shirin, which we were just discussing. when we were talking about the painting by Bizad from the previous passage. And in a lot of Islamic art, a lot of Islamic miniatures, a lot of Persian and Ottoman miniatures, the idea is that the image is supposed to connect to the larger narrative that the viewer is aware of and knows. And the viewer can connect the image that he sees, or she sees, or they see, to the larger story that they're aware of. And Enişte Effendi here, right, Black's uncle, is surprised that there is no larger story. What does he say? The painting wasn't the extension of a story at all. It was something in its own right. And he emphasizes that, to his surprise, he's actually he feels a connection to the painting, even though the man looks nothing like him. This is, of course, the power of individual depictions, individual portraits. This is the power of paintings like these Venetian portraits. They make you feel connected to the person because you are seeing another human being. If we keep reading, I never forgot the painting that bewildered me so. I left the palazzo, returned to the house where I was staying as a guest, and pondered the picture the entire night. I, too, wanted to be portrayed in this manner. But no, that wasn't appropriate. It was our Sultan who ought to be thus portrayed. Our Sultan ought to be rendered, along with everything he owned, with the things that represented and constituted his realm. I settled on the notion that a manuscript could be illustrated according to this idea. So, what he decides is that he wants the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan, to be painted with this style of portraiture, with European style of portraiture, and that he wants to make a miniature in this fashion. This is, of course, the thing that the murderer is going to object to. This is the thing that the murderer is going to be motivated to kill for. Because this is, according to our murderer, a desecration of the Herat style of miniature painting, of the very essence of miniature painting, bringing individuality into painting, a European style. But it's interesting, I think, that Black's uncle is the one who has this desire, because Black is maybe as I said, the closest thing to a protagonist. He is our traditional individual hero. He is the one we connect to as a character. And so I think the tension, right, that we're noting here, I think that tension exists within this novel as a whole. Because there is tension between, is this Black's story? Is this the story of a young man who is investigating a murder? Sort of, partially, yes. At the same time, Black is not, as I've said, the most interesting character. There is also this panoply of perspectives and characters who sometimes overshadow Black's own relatively straightforward perspective. And so we have the very tension that Black's uncle is describing, the very tension between the Ottoman school and the Venetian school of painting, embodied, right, in this novel itself. Now, the three suspects who we're introduced to kind of in the middle of the novel, Butterfly, Stork, and Olive, each of them at different points in the novel talk about painting, talk about art, tell stories. I want to just look at one particular parable, right, that one of the suspects, Stork, ends up telling, because I think this is a really insightful moment that reveals a lot about the theory of painting as embodied by a traditional miniaturist. So this is in chapter 13, and it's a subsection called Painting and Time. Long ago, as is common knowledge, the illustrators of our Islamic realm, including, for example, the old Arab masters, perceiving the world the way Frankish infidels do today, would regard everything and depict it from the level of a vagabond, mutt, or clerk at work in his shop. Unaware of today's perspectival techniques, of which the Frankish masters haughtily boast, their world remained dull and limited, restricted to the simple perspective of the mutt, or the shop clerk. Then a great event came to pass, and our entire world of illustration changed. Let me begin there. 350 years ago, when Baghdad fell to the Mongols, and was mercilessly plundered on a cold day in the month of Safar, Ibn Shakir was the most renowned and proficient calligrapher and scribe, not only of the whole Arab world, but of all Islamdom. Despite his youth, he had transcribed 22 volumes, most of which were Qurans, and could be found in the world-famous libraries of Baghdad. Ibn Shakir believed these books would last until the end of the world, and therefore lived with a deep and infinite notion of time. So remember, these are parables about time. So we're setting up different perspectives on the idea of time. So first we have we have Ibn Shakir, who is a renowned calligrapher, and he has an infinite notion of time, right? Because he believes his books are going to last until the end of the world. He toiled heroically all through the night by flickering candlelight on the last of those legendary books, which are unknown to us today because in the span of a few days they were one by one torn up, shredded, burned, and tossed into the Tigris River by the soldiers of the Mongol Khan Hulagu. This is, of course, a famous reference to the destruction of Baghdad by the Mongols in the 1200s. Again, lots of references in this novel to famous events from Islamic history, from Middle Eastern history. Continuing on. Just as the master Arab calligraphers, committed to the notion of the endless persistence of tradition and books, had for 5 centuries been in the habit of resting their eyes, as a precaution against blindness, by turning their backs to the rising sun and looking toward the western horizon, Ibn Shakir ascended the minaret of the Caliphate Mosque in the coolness of morning, and from the balcony where the muezzin called the faithful to prayer, witnessed all that would end a 5 centuries-long tradition of scribal art. First, he saw Hulagu's pitiless soldiers enter Baghdad, and yet he remained where he was atop the minaret. He watched the plunder and destruction of the entire city, the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people, the killing of the last of the caliphs of Islam who'd ruled Baghdad for half a millennium, the rape of women, the burning of libraries, and the destruction of tens of thousands of volumes as they were thrown into the Tigris. 2 days later, amid the stench of corpses and cries of death, he watched the flowing waters of the Tigris, turned red from the ink bleeding out of the books, and he thought about how all those volumes he'd transcribed in beautiful script, those books that were now gone, hadn't in the least served to stop this horrifying massacre and devastation. And in turn, he swore never to write again. Furthermore, he was struck with the desire to express his pain and the disaster he'd witnessed through painting, which until that day he'd belittled and deemed an affront to Allah. And so, making use of the paper he always carried with him, he depicted what he saw from the top of the minaret. We owe the happy miracle of the 300-year Renaissance in Islamic illustration following the Mongol invasion to that element which distinguished it from the artistry of pagans and Christians. That is, to the truly agonizing depiction of the world from an elevated, godlike position, attained by drawing none other than a horizon line. We owe this Renaissance to the horizon line, and also to Ibn Shakir's going north after the massacre he witnessed, in the direction the Mongol armies had come from, carrying with him his paintings and the ambition for illustration in his heart. In brief, we owe much to his learning the painting techniques of the Chinese masters. Thereby, it is evident that the notion of endless time that had rested in the hearts of Arab calligrapher scribes for 500 years would finally manifest itself not in writing, but in painting. The proof of this resides in the fact that the illustrations in manuscripts and volumes that had been torn apart and vanished have passed into other books and other volumes to survive forever in their revelation of Allah's worldly realm. So let's analyze that parable, right, that story. It's kind of a story, as he says, about perspective and time. So what he emphasizes is that the Frankish perspective, he calls it the Frankish because that was what they would call Europeans during the Middle Ages, right? Mainly because of the Crusades, right? The Frankish knights, people from France. He would say the Frankish school, the European school, they're obsessed with perspective. They would prefer to just depict the world from a single perspective, the perspective of a dog on the ground. And the idea is this is a limited perspective. Instead, what our calligrapher does is he climbs to the top of a minaret and sees the whole city from the perspective at the top of the minaret, and is, as a result, therefore able to paint things from a godlike point of view, not from a single point of view. And according to Stork, that is the entire basis of the miniature tradition, what he calls the 300-year Renaissance of Islamic art. Right? He's referring to basically from the 1200s, when the sack of Baghdad happened to his present, right, the 1500s, the 300-year revival of Islamic art, specifically through miniature painting, which utilized this godlike perspective. And so I think I'm presenting that parable and that story to emphasize that is the Ottoman perspective. That is the Islamic perspective on painting and on time. That this idea of a godlike perspective also implies eternity, right? Something timeless, something that will last forever. Now, when we get to the end of this novel, I want us to ask this question: was Stork correct? Did that type of perspective imply eternity? Are those works going to survive forever? I'll tell you right now, the answer is no, right? Because Orhan Pamuk is a postmodern writer writing from the present. And looking back, he knows that the world of the miniaturists went away, that the world of the miniaturists is gone. Like so many great writers, one of Orhan Pamuk's big themes is, of course, the passage of time. And in this case, what time does to artistic traditions that believed themselves to be universal. And so I think Stork ends up being incorrect because he believes that the miniaturists' style is going to last forever. So let's look at the scene where Black's uncle is killed, where Enişte Efendi is killed. So this is right in the middle of the novel, chapter 29. And basically, Black's uncle speaks to the murderer. Now, we don't know who the murderer is yet. Even though we're seeing this from the perspective of Black's uncle, we don't get a name. Black's uncle kind of very wisely and intelligently psychoanalyzes, right, our murderer, and unlocks the kind of the key, this key feeling, right, that the murderer has about why he killed him. And it has to do with this anxiety around being a painter. He wants to be recognized for his painting, right? Simultaneously, he fears the incursion of European individualistic styles of art. And yet, at the same time, he wants to be recognized for his own personal style. And the key section, right, the key sort of speech by Black's uncle that I want to really read and focus on. So right before the murderer decides to kill him, Black's uncle has this long speech where he acknowledges that there is something seductive about the Venetian style of painting. He says there's an undeniable allure to the paintings they make by those new methods. And, our assassin basically says, well, we Ottomans can make portraits as well as the Venetians. And what does Black's uncle say in response? He says, we won't. Haven't you learned from your victim, the late elegant Effendi, how afraid we are of being labeled imitators of the Franks? Even if we venture bravely to paint like them, it'll amount to the same thing. In the end, our methods will die out, our colors will fade. No one will care about our books and our paintings, and those who do express interest will ask with a sneer, with no understanding whatsoever, why there's no perspective, or else they won't be able to find the manuscripts at all. Indifference, time, and disaster will destroy our art. The Arabian glue used in the bindings contains fish, honey, and bone, and the pages are sized and polished with a finish made from egg white and starch. Greedy, shameless mice will nibble these pages away. Termites, worms, and 1,000 varieties of insect will gnaw our manuscripts out of existence. Bindings will fall apart and pages will drop out. And he goes on and on here. Now, we're not going to read this whole thing, but he just goes on and on to describe all the various ways that the manuscripts that they create, the paintings they create, will not last, right? The way time will eat away and destroy the artistic work that they have painstakingly created. Notice how different this point of view is from the point of view of Stork, which we read earlier, right? The point of view that believed that miniatures could be eternal, right? That what the miniaturists created could be outside of time. Black's uncle is saying, no, there is no outside of time. The books are mortal. The paintings are mortal, right? They won't last forever. And he concludes this long monologue. Let's look at the final sort of section, which he concludes he concludes with this beautiful long sentence. It's an extremely long sentence. I'm not going to be able to read the whole thing because it goes on for over a page. But if we just kind of pick it up right towards the end. So what he does here is he lists all of the different things that appear in the different paintings. He says not only our own art, but every single work made in this world over the years will vanish in fires, be destroyed by worms, or be lost out of neglect. And then he starts listing different things that might be painted by miniatures. Shireen proudly watching Husrev from a window. Husrev delightfully spying on Shireen as she bathes by moonlight. Lovers gazing at each other with grace and subtlety. And he goes on and on and on and on and on and lists the different things that might be painted. Your graceful hunting sultans, and with the same finesse your startled fleeing gazelles, your dying shahs, your prisoners of war, your infidel galleons and your rival cities, your shiny dark nights that glimmer as if night itself had flowed from your pen, your stars, your ghost-like cypresses, your red-tinted pictures of love and death, yours and all the rest, all of it will vanish. And right then, the murderer kills him. And it's such a mesmerizing and beautiful passage. I think the most extraordinary passage in the novel because, Black's uncle is articulating, I think, what Orhan Pamuk himself believes, that miniaturists might have this dream of eternity, might believe that their art is going to be there forever, but Black's uncle is wise enough to understand the reality of time. It will not last forever. In fact, as the ending of this book is going to make clear, it's already on its way out. We've already seen the golden age of miniature painting. These Ottoman miniaturists, they live in the twilight of miniature painting. And, personally, I find that to be a very moving idea of the tragedy of art. We live in a time where, and I can't predict the future. I don't know what's going to happen, but we live in a time where it's completely possible that we are witnessing a similar kind of artistic transformation to what Orhan Pamuk is describing in My Name is Red. With the invention of the internet, with the kinds of technology that we have today, it's possible that the book is on its way out. The book itself, that literature is on its way out. I mean, part of the reason I'm creating this podcast is out of fear that might be true, right? Out of fear, the same motivations in some way as the murderer in this novel, right? I am afraid that this art form that I've devoted essentially my entire life to up to this point, and know that I will devote the rest of my life to, that this entire art form might become obsolete in my lifetime. That fewer people might read, that the people who are interested in culture might become interested in other things, that other things might replace novels. I mean, these are all the same anxieties that the characters in this book are facing, that the characters in this book are experiencing. And Black's uncle, I think, is the only one of the few people wise enough to realize that, yeah, you know what? It probably is on its way out, that it probably is dying, but that, of course, everything dies, that nothing is immortal. And maybe that's the wise answer here. All right, let's look at a few more passages to kind of bring this all to a close. I mean, there's so much we could look at, but I want to focus on one other major character is Master Osman, who, after Black's uncle dies, he sort of becomes the elder figure of the novel. He's the master of the miniature workshop. And I want to look at a section. So this is chapter 49. It's a chapter from Black's perspective. But in this chapter, he has this conversation with Master Osman, where they're basically looking through. What basically they're trying to do is they're trying to look through. They did this contest where they had everyone draw a horse, right? And they sort of are using this horse to try and see if the miniaturist has a style. They're trying to decide who is the murderer. Is it Stork, Butterfly, or Olive? And they have each of these three draw a horse, and then they're going to compare this horse to certain other, miniaturists, certain other illustrations of horses to try and spot a certain stylistic tick that might explain to them something. But in doing this, what they end up doing is they end up uncovering all of these old miniatures, and they're very affected by what they find. So this is kind of in the middle, toward the end of the chapter. It crossed my mind that, just perhaps, Master Osman's main goal was not to find horses with peculiarly drawn noses, but to scrutinize as much as possible these spectacular pictures that had slept quietly for years in this treasury, safe from prying eyes. I grew so impatient to find the clues that would unite me with Shekure, who awaited me at the house, that I'd been loath to believe that the great master might want to stay in the icy treasury as long as possible. Thus did we persist in opening other cabinets, other chests, shown us by the aged dwarf, to examine the pictures therein. Periodically I'd get fed up with the pictures, which all looked alike, and wish never again to watch Husrev visit Shirin under the castle window. I'd leave the master's side without even a glance at the nostrils of the horse Husrev rode, and try to warm myself at the brazier, or I'd walk respectfully and awestruck among the heaps of cloth, gold, weapons, armor, and plunder in the adjacent rooms of the treasury. So jumping ahead, we watched as hundreds of shahs, kings, sultans, and khans, who'd ruled from the thrones of various kingdoms and empires from the time of Tamerlane to Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, happily and excitedly hunted gazelles, lions, and rabbits. So, he describes a bunch of different illustrations that they saw. And then jumping ahead, I don't know how much more time we spent examining book after book and illustration after illustration in this manner. It was as if the unchanging, frozen, golden time revealed in the pictures and stories we viewed had thoroughly mingled with the damp and moldy time we experienced in the treasury. It seemed that these illuminated pages, created over the centuries by the lavish expenditure of eyesight in the workshops of countless shahs, khans, and sultans, would come to life, as would the objects that seemed to besiege us. The helmets, scimitars, daggers with diamond-studded handles, armor, porcelain cups from China, dusty and delicate lutes, and the pearl-embellished cushions and kilims, the likes of which we'd seen in countless illustrations. So, this is the key passage here, because what is Black experiencing? Remember, at the beginning, he was kind of fed up with all this manuscript, these manuscripts. He was getting tired. He didn't want to keep looking at all these manuscripts. But now, he starts to be moved by them, right? He says, it was as if the unchanging, frozen, golden time revealed in the pictures and stories. Now that's key, because that's a description of what time is like in these miniatures. Remember, right, that parable we read by Stork. These miniatures attempt to freeze time and turn it into something eternal. What is the phrase Black uses here? The unchanging, frozen, golden time. That's what time is like in these paintings. They capture and freeze time and make it eternal. And he says it's as if that time began mingling with the damp and moldy time of the treasury. In other words, he feels as if he is experiencing almost this sense of eternity while looking at these pictures, right? The present does seem suddenly suffused by this golden time that the paintings and the miniatures represented. He almost feels like all these things are going to come to life. That's how good these miniatures are. Then Master Osman speaks. He says, I now understand that by furtively and gradually recreating the same pictures for hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of artists had cunningly depicted the gradual transformation of their world into another. So we're going to analyze what this means in a moment, but let's see Black's reaction. I'll be the first to admit that I didn't completely understand what the great master meant. But the close attention my master had shown to the thousands of pictures made over the last 200 years, from Bukhara to Herat, from Tabriz to Baghdad, and all the way to Istanbul, had far exceeded the search for a clue in the depiction of some horse's nostrils. We'd participated in a kind of melancholy elegy to the inspiration, talent, and patience of all the masters who'd painted and illuminated in these lands over the years. So what does it mean then, right? Osman is saying he realizes that these masters, right, they'd all painted the same painting over and over again for hundreds of years, and that implicitly and, what does he say, cunningly, they had depicted the transformation of their world into another. In other words, he's looking back at these manuscripts and he's realizing this is a lost world, that the current world of the Ottoman Empire is not the world of these old Herat miniatures, that world has been gradually transformed into this one. So, Black experienced these manuscript miniatures as almost timeless. But Osman is conscious of time. He says, it's clear that time has been passing as I look at these miniatures. And so then Black has this kind of elegiac reflection where he says, we had participated in a kind of melancholy elegy to the inspiration, talent, and patience of all these masters. They start to feel melancholy then because they look at these old paintings and they realize that this is an elegy, what they're feeling. They're feeling something elegiac because they realize that these paintings depict a world that no longer exists. These paintings are depicting a reality that has vanished. And that's what Osman realizes, and that's what Black realizes here too. Again, that's also what Black's uncle had already realized and understood when he was murdered. That, of course, time is too powerful. That time will eat away at everything the miniaturists tried to create. All right, so let's look at just a few more sections, right? The very end, right, when Black finally does discover that Olive is in fact the murderer. We're not going to look at that section because, again, it's quite long. There's a lot of detail there. But I want to look just at the very end where he dies. The very end, because there's this interesting reflection on the idea, once again, of time. So he's describing what he saw as he's dying, right? So he says, this is what they call death. But I knew that I wasn't dead yet. My punctured pupils were motionless, but I could still see quite well through my open eyes. What I saw from ground level filled my thoughts. The road inclining slightly upward, the wall, the arch, the roof of the workshop, the sky. This is how the picture receded. So at first he's viewing the world from a specific perspective, right, in the European style. It seemed as if this moment of observation went on, and I realized seeing had become a variety of memory. I was reminded of what I thought when staring for hours at a beautiful picture. If you stare long enough, your mind enters the time of the painting. All time had now become this time. So there's a kind of irony here, is that he's seeing the world from this specific perspective, from his own perspective, in the kind of European style, not in a miniature style. And yet he's experiencing time the way Stork described earlier, the way the miniaturist described it, as this eternal thing. What does he say? All time had now become this time, right? The time of the painting. It seemed as if no one would see me. As my thoughts faded away, my mud-covered head would go on staring at this melancholy incline, the stone wall, and the nearby yet unattainable mulberry and chestnut trees for years. So what does he say? He feels frustrated that the eternity that he finally experiences upon death is the eternity of a European-style painting, right? He's trapped in his own perspective for eternity. This endless waiting suddenly assumed such bitter and tedious proportions. I wanted nothing more than to quit this time. I think that death scene is Pamuk's final commentary there on the distinction between European and Ottoman styles of painting. As our murderer who wanted to preserve the Ottoman style ends up being trapped in the European perspective and yet is experiencing eternity in the way the miniaturist dreamed. Only it's not the eternity of God's vision. It's not the eternity of the miniaturist's perspective. It's eternity, but from a European perspective, right? He basically says, what does he say? He says, he's going to be staring at this same stone wall, this same melancholy incline, the same unattainable mulberry and chestnut trees for years. So I think that's such a fitting and sad ending, right, for our murderer to be trapped in that particular perspective. Now, one more passage I want to look at, which I think brings this all together, is how does Black's story end? How does our protagonist's story end? There's a really interesting moment where So the final chapter is told from the perspective of Shakure, right, Black's love interest. And she reflects on how, despite the fact that he found the murderer, he remains melancholy. So let's look at this section right towards the end. Whatever the cause, Black always remained melancholy. Because I knew that his sadness had nothing to do with his shoulder, I believed that somewhere in a secret corner of his soul he was possessed by a djinn of sorrow that dampened his mood even during our most exhilarating moments of lovemaking. To appease that djinn, at times he'd drink wine, at times stare at illustrations in books, and take an interest in art. At times he'd even spend his days and nights with miniaturists chasing after pretty boys. There were periods when he entertained himself in the company of painters, calligraphers, and poets in orgies of puns, double entendres, innuendos, metaphors, and games of flattery. And there were periods when he forgot everything and surrendered himself to secretarial duties and a government clerkship under hunched Suleiman Pasha, into whose service he'd managed to enter. 4 years later, when our Sultan died, and with the ascension of Sultan Mehmed, who turned his back entirely on all artistry, Black's enthusiasm for illustration and painting turned from an openly celebrated pleasure into a private secret, pursued behind closed doors. There were times when he'd open one of the books left to us by my father and stare, guilty and sad, at an illustration made during the era of Tamerlane's sons in Herat. Yes, Shireen falling in love with Husrev after seeing his picture, not as if it were part of a happy game of talent still being played in palace circles, but as if he were dwelling upon a sweet secret long surrendered to memory. So what an incredible passage that just concludes this. It's not the very end of the novel, but it's essentially this final melancholy elegiac note. Black is melancholy because he realizes that the artistic style of the old miniaturists, right, these paintings that he and Osman looked at in that treasury, he understands that that style has disappeared, right? The new Sultan is no longer interested in art. And what does this line say? That he looked at this painting, right? He looked at this painting not as if it were a happy game of talent. He no longer looks at this painting happily. He looks at it as if it's a sweet secret, long surrendered to memory. In a way, what Black realizes at the end is exactly what Master Osman realized earlier in the novel, right? When he realized that the world of these Herat miniatures was gone. And so I think the ultimate kind of brilliance of this novel comes down to this idea that the murderer was right. Olive was right. You know, his fear that the Frankish style would replace the Ottoman style in many ways was the correct fear. And it's a fear that's shared by so many characters in this novel. It's a fear that's acknowledged by Black's uncle right before he dies. It's a fear that's also shared by Master Osman, of course. It's a realization he comes to, and it's the reason he blinds himself. And over here, it's a fear and melancholy that Black ultimately comes to experience and comes to feel. He too realizes what the murderer understood. And I think that's the kind of brilliance of this novel, is that by the end, you know, even though it's a traditional happy ending, right? The murderer has been discovered, right? He's been brought to justice, etc., etc. But it's not a happy ending. It's a very melancholy and sad ending, because what Orhan Pamuk, I think, is suggesting and implying here is that the murderer was right, that there is something to fear, that this style of art that means so much is in fact declining. And the other miniaturists, you know, in particular Stork, whose section we looked at earlier, they were wrong. The miniaturist's world is not an eternal world. It's not going to last forever. Black's uncle was correct, right? That ultimately time will devour everything. And, you know, I think the sort of extra level of brilliance to this novel, right, is the fact that this is a historical novel written in the 1990s. You know, 400 years after the events took place, it's pretty clear, right, that the murderer was correct. That the Ottoman style of art is now, you know, it's considered beautiful by historians, by people in the Middle East, perhaps, right? A lot of those paintings are recognized for their strange beauty, but it has not had the dominance that the European style has had. The European emphasis on perspective and individuality, in the end, that style won. And Ottoman miniatures became part of a faded historical world. And looking back, we can see that what they realized was correct, what Osman and Black realized was correct, that the golden age of the Herat miniatures, the golden age of miniatures, was in the past. That the Ottoman era really represented the twilight of that artistic style. And you could even argue that this particular book is set during that twilight, right? During the final flourishing and then death of that style of art. So if we reflect more generally, right, what is Orhan Pamuk talking about here? Why is this novel such a masterpiece? It's because thematically it's addressing this question of the fading of an artistic world. And you know what? I don't know if Orhan Pamuk wrote this kind of feeling or knowing or thinking that something like literature might experience this same style of death. I think he was fully in the world of miniatures and art. But I read this book and I can't help but draw that parallel to literature, draw that parallel to novels. Less than 30 years after this novel came out, right? Because this novel came out in 1998. 28 years after this novel came out, and it's pretty clear that literature might be undergoing a similar type of fading to miniatures. So what do we do about it? It's quite tragic, of course. We could lament in the tragedy, as some of these characters do. We could sort of fade into melancholy. But the very ending of the novel, I think, provides an interesting answer to this. That section that I read about Black's melancholy, that is actually not the last page of the book. The last page of the book ends with a much more hopeful and optimistic note. So I just want to read these last paragraphs from Shikure's perspective, because I think they provide a nice hopeful antidote to this melancholy reflection on, the decline of artistic mediums and artistic styles. So Shikure is reflecting on what does she want, right? What are the two different things she secretly wants painted? So she says, my whole life I've secretly very much wanted two paintings made, which I've never mentioned to anybody. So the first is her portrait, right? She wants a portrait of herself. This is, of course, the European style. The second thing she wants, a picture of bliss, what the poet blonde Nazim of Ran had pondered in one of his verses. I know quite well how this painting ought to be made. Imagine the picture of a mother with her two children, the younger one whom she cradles in her arms, nursing him as she smiles, suckles happily at her bountiful breast, smiling as well. The eyes of the slightly jealous older brother, and those of the mother should be locked. I'd like to be the mother in that picture. I'd want the bird in the sky to be depicted as if flying, and at the same time happily and eternally suspended there, in the style of the old masters of Herat, who were able to stop time. I know it's not easy. So what does she want at the end? She wants a fusion of the two artistic styles. She wants a reconciliation and a synthesis. She wants the beautiful eternity of the style of Herat, and she wants the individuality of the European style. So I think in her character, we see the answer, the fusion of these two styles. If we continue reading, my son Orhan, who's foolish enough to be logical in all matters, reminds me on the one hand that the time-halting masters of Herat could never depict me as I am, and on the other hand that the Frankish masters who perpetually painted mother with child portraits could never stop time. Right? What he's saying there is her son is telling her, well, here's the problem with your painting, right? These are the two things that each of those styles could never achieve. He's been insisting for years that my picture of bliss could never be painted anyhow. Perhaps he's right. In actuality, we don't look for smiles and pictures of bliss, but rather for the happiness in life itself. Painters know this, but this is precisely what they cannot depict. That's why they substitute the joy of seeing for the joy of life. So what does she say there? She says, in the end, painters can never really capture bliss, right? They substitute the joy of seeing for the joy of life, but she's implying that there is a joy to life that can never be painted, right? There is a joy to life that is never going to be depicted in a painting. In the hopes that he might pen this story, which is beyond depiction, I've told it to my son Orhan. Without hesitation, I gave him the letters Hassan and Black sent me, along with the rough horse illustrations with the smeared ink, which were found on poor elegant Effendi. Above all, don't be taken in by Orhan if he's drawn Black more absent-minded than he is, made our lives harder than they are, Shekvet worse, and me prettier and harsher than I am. For the sake of a delightful and convincing story, there isn't a lie Orhan wouldn't deign to tell. So it ends with this beautiful kind of postmodern meta flourish, right, where her son Orhan is, of course, a stand-in for Orhan Pamuk, the author, who is telling us this story. And she's acknowledging that, yes, it might not be totally accurate. This kind of, I love that because it's this final postmodern kind of twist to suggest that, yes, life can't be the same as art. Life can't be the same as a painting. Life can't be the same as a book. But there is something hopeful, right, in that final note, where she's suggesting that even though this style of painting that she secretly craves, right, this combination and synthesis of the two artistic styles, even though it might be impossible to capture in a painting, she's implying that it's not impossible to capture in real life. And so I think that's perhaps the kind of conclusion that Pamuk comes to here, right, is that, you know, you have this fading of these artistic styles, but in the people who survive, in this case in Shakure, right, the character who represents this hope, you have this possibility of the future. So he doesn't end his novel in total melancholy. He does end it with this optimism and with this hope, with this idea that future generations will tell this story, tell it in their own way, in their own style, and that there will be meaning in that telling. All right, so we're going to wrap up there. Thank you guys for listening. I know we went long today, but this is a wonderful novel that's so rich and so detailed and worth diving into at this length. Remember, if you like the podcast, please like, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you all next time.